Kenneth Cecil McClure. Through his superior intellect and his devotion to duty, his accomplishments as a high-latitude researcher, and development of a practical polar grid navigation system, he has made a superb contribution to aviation in Canada's polar regions and safer worldwide air transport operations. Kenneth Cecil McClure was born in Montreal on October 14, 1914. He completed high school there and entered McGill University on a full scholarship. He graduated in 1934 with a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics and physics. When World War II broke out in 1939, he was selected among the top McGill graduates to initiate the training of navigators for the newly planned British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, or BCATP. He joined the RCAF and began the first instructor's course in navigation at Trenton, Ontario. In 1941, McClure was posted to the Royal Air Force Air Navigation School at Port Albert, Ontario. A recently developed Link celestial navigation trainer there was able to simulate flights at all latitudes, including the polar region. This intrigued him and further stimulated his interest in problems associated with polar navigation. With his solid background in mathematics and physics and an interest in the basics of air navigation, Kenneth McClure set about finding answers. His study culminated in a definitive paper on polar navigation, which was published in the fall of 1941. While not the first to suggest a grid overlay, he was the first to propose a method of using it effectively. He named it the Greenwich grid, since his proposal involved drawing reference lines parallel to the Greenwich meridian. Acknowledging that the magnetic compass was of very little use in the polar region, he suggested that a directional gyroscope could provide a stable and practical steering reference. He then described how the procedure was to be used to maintain a desired heading using the astrocompass, celestial bodies, and a constant scale chart such as the polar stereographic with the Greenwich grid overlay. The traditional coordinates of latitude and longitude would continue to be used to identify a geographic location, as well as the position of the aircraft. Because the war demanded all available resources, nothing further was made of this highly significant development, although it was a matter of serious discussion at high levels in RAF, RCAF, and U.S. military circles. McClure's paper remained under security wraps until the end of World War II. In October 1941, he was assigned to oversee navigation training at the BCATP schools in Western Canada. The following year, McClure, then a squadron leader, attended the first specialist navigation course in England. He then returned to Canada, where he held senior navigation training positions. He was now an acting wing commander. In November 1944, at the request of the RAF, McClure again went overseas to serve as Director, Test and Development at the Empire Air Navigation School in Shawbury, which was considered the leading Allied air navigation school at the time. Planning now began under his guidance to test the grid navigation system. In May 1945, a specially modified Lancaster bomber aircraft named Ares undertook a series of flights to both the North Geographic and North Magnetic poles. These flights, involving 110 hours flying time between May 17th and 26th, established the Greenwich grid as a fully practical and safe routing navigation technique. One of the flights also established that the North Magnetic Pole was about 480 kilometers north-northwest of the charted position, further emphasizing the failure of the magnetic compass as a steering reference. To obtain his instrument readings, Wing Commander McClure worked under extreme conditions, spending up to 19 hours at a time confined to the rear of the Lancaster's fuselage, where inside temperatures were almost as cold as outside, often down to minus 65 degrees. Following a stopover in Whitehorse, Yukon, a direct flight was made back to Shawbury, England, once again successfully employing the Greenwich grid navigation technique. Thus, McClure was the first Canadian to fly over the North Geographic Pole. Upon completion of the Ares flights, McClure received the Air Force Cross from the RAF in recognition of his contributions as the senior navigator directing all aspects of the Ares research flights. The U.S. Institute of Navigation honored him with their prestigious Thurlow Award in recognition of his outstanding contribution to the science of navigation in 1945. He was the first recipient of this award. On his return to Canada in 1946, McClure was seconded to the Arctic section of the Defence Research Board. By this time, the Greenwich grid system had gained wide recognition. His writing and speaking engagements ranged from consulting with the U.S. military on the Greenwich grid technique to addressing the Royal Geographic Society in the UK on the technical aspects of the Aries polar flights. In 1948, McClure returned to McGill University for postgraduate studies in physics and acquired an MSc in 1950 and a doctorate in nuclear physics in 1952. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation in 1949. During the early 1950s, McClure returned to the field of research as senior test engineer at the Central Experimental and Proving Establishment at RCAF Station Rockcliffe. Promoted to group captain in 1958, he served at Air Force Headquarters as Director of Armament Engineering. He was later posted as the Canadian military attaché to Warsaw, Poland, where he served for 3 years. On his return to Canada in 1961, he was again seconded to the Defence Research Board, this time to the Pacific Naval Laboratory at Esquimalt, BC. He was engaged in acoustic and electromagnetic research in ice-filled waters, a matter of extreme importance to the RCAF anti-submarine operations. Unfortunately, because of the military sensitivity of much of his work, his contributions are not widely known outside of the military. McClure retired from the RCAF in November 1969, but he continued as head of the Electromagnetic Research Group at Esquimalt, conducting research in the Arctic on undersea and ice experiments out of Resolute Bay, Northwest Territories. In 1971, he was appointed Chief of Defence Research Staff at the Canadian High Commission, London. He returned to Esquimalt in 1975 as Senior Research and Development Planning Officer. He was elected Fellow of the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute in 1976. He retired in October 1979. Kenneth McClure and his wife Margaret raised 4 children, and upon retirement they continued to live in Ottawa. Group Captain McClure died suddenly on March 28, 1988, while vacationing in Mexico. Kenneth Cecil McClure was inducted as a member of Canada's Aviation Hall of Fame at ceremonies held in Edmonton June 4, 2005.